My name is Haley Beard, and I work as a domestic violence specialist at Ketchikan Indian Community. We work specifically with Alaskan Native women who experience domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. We do this through advocacy, education, and intervention. We help out with legal advocacy, basic financial needs, and just anywhere that we can fill in. That's what advocacy is. When people come to us who have experienced and identify as victims, we help them navigate the legal system, housing system, referrals, resources in the community. Alaskan Native women experience domestic violence at one of the highest rates in the United States. Alaskan Native and Native women experience violence. Okay, so I'm going to just say here, pause for a second. Okay, Alaskan Native women and Alaska have the highest rates of domestic violence and sexual assault in the United States. And unfortunately, our community isn't spared from that violence. 1 in 2 women in Ketchikan will experience domestic violence or sexual assault at one time in their lifetime. And about 86.3 Alaskan Native women will experience violence or sexual assault during their lifetime. And I know with the women that we work with here in Ketchikan, it's oftentimes that statistic doesn't ring true, not because it's just a large amount, but because most of the women that I meet have experienced violence at some point in their lifetime. It's about, I'd say, 100% just from what we've surveyed personally in our program at KIC. So that's why Violence Against Women Act through the Department of Justice set aside special funding to help out with equity in our communities. So we have this grant for transitional housing, and it's not that we have the actual transitional housing, is that we help women transition into safe housing. And so that funding is for basic needs. A lot of times we end up buying people furniture or deposits, just things that are really hard to come up with that extra money, especially if you're working in minimum wage. And we know that our Alaskan Native population here doesn't just struggle with violence in their life, intimate partner violence that is, but also violence through extreme poverty, lack of education, and that's why we're here a little bit to talk about that.
What, why is this, do you know reasons, why this is an issue, inter-partner violence and sexual assault, why is it the highest percent in Alaska for the Native populations?
Yeah. So a lot of times people say, well, why do you get the special funding, on top of the regular state's funding for domestic violence or sexual assault? Why are these such high rates? And a lot of it goes back to colonization, really, that a people stripped of their identity and forced in submission through colonization by a more dominant group creates violence in the life. And a lot of times that violence mimics the same kind of violence that batters, people who use a set of tactics to control another person to obtain power and control over them. They look a lot the same as colonization did, or the way that sometimes governments can use force to get others to submit. And so it's not just a few deranged individuals that perpetrate violence. It's actually becomes very normalized in our society when we when we're taught it. We're not just taught that seeing our parents, or it's the way that systematic racism works. It is why they have student exchange programs still, particularly with classism. So people do whole dissertations on this subject, but ultimately it comes down to when you're being forced into submission to assimilate to a different culture, then that just creates violence in your life. And unfortunately, Alaskan Natives, just until very recently, if you think about the human race, were not allowed to practice their culture, nor had rights, or were told that they were human. We think of great figures like Elizabeth Pratovich that really helped push Alaskan Natives forward. And also, we don't have reservations. We're a Public Law 280 state, and so that means that the state can intervene and have more say technically on the land, because there is no sacred land set aside for the Alaskan Natives specifically. So there's a plethora of different reasons that we could go over, but really it's like when we force others into submission, and that's what happened with the culture, and that's what happens in intimate partner relationships too. When you show that your partner that you will use physical violence to get them to submit, change the whole dynamics in the relationship.
What role do you think gender inequality and balance has on DV and SA?
Gender inequality, that's like, oh man, these are big overarching questions, but I guess when you work in the field of domestic violence, it kind of just comes to that we don't really have like a simple answer for you here, but I know in rural communities in Alaska, we have some of the biggest pay gaps in Alaska, in the United States especially. And so what that ends up looking like is financial abuse, which is just one of the tactics that somebody that's a batterer, so somebody that uses different tactics to gain power and control over you, might use. And so with that, it might look like somebody going out and fishing for the summer, and then he comes home and the house isn't how he wants it to be, and he has the money and is able to maybe kick somebody out in the street, when they don't do what they say they're gonna do, or is not having the power they want over their partner. So that's a big one that we see here. And batterers, abusive people, typically when they're not working, they tend to be more abusive. They have more time on their hands, less to think about with a job, and so they can become fixated on their partner. And we have a lot of seasonal work here for people, especially in blue collar jobs, which are male dominated.
Could you just maybe, I could edit this, but talk about what is domestic violence? Maybe people don't even know.
Okay, yeah, we could do that. Let's see. So domestic violence is defined as somebody using power and control over you by using physical violence. There's different definitions in the legal system and justice system to define it. Okay, so domestic violence is when you live in a same household with another person. Sorry, it's okay. I'm just used to. So, okay, domestic violence by the legal system is defined when you have lived in the same household as somebody else. It's considered like sexual assault or stalking when you have never lived or been intimate with that other person, but domestic violence still could look like sexual assault. as well, but it's just defined once you've lived with that person or had an intimate relationship outside of the violence with them, that's when it becomes domestic. So if I have a roommate, it would be domestic violence if we got into a scuffle, as opposed to intimate partner violence. That's when I've been intimate with someone, but it would still be domestic even if I've never lived with them before.
Going back to, so how do you think the issue of DV systems, we kind of talked about this, rooted in colonization?
Do you think I covered it fine?
These are her questions, probably.
Okay, yeah.
What I understood was because there was such a, they've been hurt, their culture is traumatized, and so that.
So, yeah, colonization is a very large part of domestic violence and other types of violence that we see in our communities here in Alaska. We have been colonized a lot later than Native Americans down south. And so it's a lot of our violence, it's still that cycle. And in Tlingit and many other indigenous tribal belief systems, we believe that if we heal ourselves, we can heal 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So we're still seeing a lot of violence and healing in our communities. And there's only been a certain amount of activism, I'd say in the past 10 years, around rebuilding our culture. They say when the hearts of